निगमकल्पतरोर्गलितं फलं शुकमुखात् अमृतद्रव संयुतं पिबत भागवतं रसमालयं मुहुरहो रसिका भुवि भावुकाः यं हिनं यतयन्ते पुरुषं पुरुषर्षभ समदुःख सुखं धीरं सोमृतत्वाय कल्पते नासतो विद्यते भावः नाभावो विद्यते सतः उभयोरपि दृष्टान्तः त्वनयोः तत्त्वदर्शिभिः Tattvadarshi Jadabharata is engaging in a profound conversation with King Rahugana. This fascinating conversation between King Rahugana and Jadabharata begins quite interestingly. It begins with a very sarcastic address by the king, followed by some very insulting words spoken in order to provoke Jadabharata. And then Rahugana realizes Jadabharata as a Tattvadarshi and submits himself to Jadabharata. Rahugana is in search of the answer to a question. Kim iha aranam? Kim iha aranam? Aranam. Security, secure shelter. Rahugana tells Jadabharata that he is on his way to meet with Kapila in order to obtain Brahmajnana and find the answer to a question that has been puzzling him for quite some time. Kim iha aranam. This is how we concluded last week, seeking answer to this question. What in this world is the most secure shelter? The most secure shelter. All of us are constantly in search, constantly seeking shelter. Shelter refers to that in which we seek relief. We seek relief from distress. We seek relief from the fragility of life. We seek relief from the unpredictability. Shelter is that which gives us a sense of security. We are all constantly seeking security all the time. Seeking the unchangeable ground on which our life can be built. Seeking an unchangeable foundation on which life's endeavors can be carried out. All of us are after finding a shelter. An infant finds shelter in the parents. A patient finds shelter in the doctor. A victim finds shelter in the police. We all find shelter in people and objects all the time. We find shelter in our property, in a house, in our possessions. While all these kinds of material shelters are essential to a degree. They are all subject to change. They are all temporary, constantly changing all the time. No material object can actually provide a sense of security that we are seeking. It is impossible to find unchanging sense of security both in people and in objects. Nevertheless, we continue to seek shelter in people and objects, in material things, all the time. In a way, our pursuit of a secure shelter is actually a search for spirituality, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. In a way, every human being is in search for spirituality unknowingly, because every human being is actually in the pursuit of a secure shelter. The spiritual reality is that which is distinct and different from the material reality. There are two realities, physical and spiritual. The spiritual reality is a higher reality, which is not subject to change, which is distinct and different from the physical reality, a reality to which we belong to. This is what Krishna in the Gita declares, Nasato vidyate bhavaha, na bhavo vidyate sataha, bhayorapi drishtantaha, tvanayoho tattvadarshinihi. Nasato vidyate bhavaha, asataha bhavaha, na bhava vidyate. Asataha, asataha, sataha. Asat here is the body, the physical body, which is insentient, which does not possess knowledge. The physical body, asat, has no permanent existence. Na bhavaha vidyate, has no permanent existence. On the contrary, na bhava, nasato vidyate bhavaha, na bhavo vidyate sataha. Sat. Sat always has permanent existence all the time. Sat, the sentient soul, the indweller in the body, has an existence that is permanent, that is eternal. The physical reality keeps constantly changing, always is in a flux. Whereas the spiritual reality, which is higher, is never subject to change, is always in a state of permanence. The spiritual reality is like a lifeline. So imagine we are stranded on a small piece of land in an ocean. We are stranded in an ocean on a small piece of land, and this small piece of land is full of thorns, full of sharp rocks. We are undergoing torture standing on this small piece of land in the ocean. However, we cannot give up on this shelter. We consider this source of torture as our very shelter. We cannot give away this shelter even though it is a torture, for fear of being doomed, until we see a lifeline being thrown to us from a ship. The moment a lifeline is thrown to us, then we are ready to easily give up on the small piece of land, which has been a source of torture all along, a source of distress all along. The fear is the root of all the insecurity, the search for shelter. So therefore, a sense of security, a sense of fearlessness is an outcome of the recognition and the realization of our essence and the presence of the source of all shelters, unchanging source of all shelters within us. The one who realizes and recognizes this is what is Krishna calls him as a dhira. Yamhina vyatayante purusham purusharshava samadukka sukham dhiram somrtatvaya kalpate. Amrtatvaya kalpate. One qualifies for immortality when one can balance, when one can balance the extremes, the dualities of life. Life is a series of experiences. Every experience arises, exists temporarily, and then perishes. No experience is permanent. Every experience is a result of the contact of the senses with the sense objects. And the dhiraha, one who realizes and recognizes one's own unchangeable essence and the presence of the source of all shelters, Bhagavan, Paramatma, within, he can easily balance both sukha, the pain and pleasure, sukha and dukkha, which are constantly alternating all the time. Jadabharata is that dhiraha. This is what Rahu Gana discovers. Yamhina vyatayante te purusham purusharshabha samadhukka sukham dhiram somrtatvaya kalpate. This is exactly what Jadabharata stands for. And Rahu Gana discovers that Jadabharata is that Tattvajnani. Rahu Gana therefore seeks certain clarifications from Jadabharata. Jadabharata made some profound declarations. And now Rahu Gana seeks clarifications. Drishtaha shamak karmata atmano vai bhartur gantur bhavatascha anumanam anumanye yata sadasoda anyanyad abhavat samula ishtaha yavahara margaha. Drishtaha shramaha karmato atmano vai. Now Jadabharata made a very intriguing comment. He said he is not the one who is the carrier of the palanquin, and he is not the one who is fatigued. Now Rahu Gana seeks clarification. Rahu Gana says, hey Jadabharata, drishtaha shramah karmato atmano vai. I know and I experience fatigue when I perform physical activity. How can you say there is no fatigue? How can you say that you are not fatigued? How can you say you are not tired when you carry out activities? Whenever one carries out physical activities with the body, Atman also experiences fatigue. So I myself have experienced fatigue all the time whenever I engage in physical activity. Bhartur ghantur bhavatascha anumanye. And I can also infer that when you carried the load of the palanquin, you must also have experienced that fatigue. Yata asata uda ananyadya abhavat. It should be very clear that if water has to be carried, it cannot be carried in a non-existent utensil. There has to be a utensil, there has to be some pot to carry water. For the phenomenal world to exist, the phenomenal world, the world that we see, perceive, deal with our senses, the phenomenal world has to be also supported, carried by something. So therefore, I cannot understand here, Bharata, when you said you are not the carrier of the palanquin, because Jadabharata made a comment saying, I am not the carrier of the palanquin. My body is the carrier of the palanquin. The Rahu Gana wants clarification. How can you say that? How can you say when you, the composite entity of the Atman and the body together have carried the palanquin, the experiencer also has a role. The Atman has to experience fatigue. The Atman is the supporter of the body, and therefore, how can you say that you are not the carrier of the palanquin? Also, it is a common experience. Rahugana says, Sthalyagmitapat payaso abhitapas tattapatas tandula garbharandihi dehendriyasvasya sannikarshat tat samstrashah purushanyat anuruddhat. He says, it is a common experience that when you take a kettle, sthali is a kettle, a cooking pot. You pour water in the pot and you put the pot on fire. And it is a common experience that when the pot is heated, the water inside the pot also is heated. And then when you put grain in the water, slowly the grain also starts to get softened. So therefore, when the pot is heated, the pot conducts the heat to the water. The water conducts the heat to the grain, to the outer portion of the grain, and eventually to the inner portion, and the grain also softens. This is a common experience, a matter of common experience. Similarly, when the Atman comes in contact with the body, the physical body, and the sense organ, the jnanendriyas and the karmendriyas, the Atman also has to undergo, also has to be affected, has to undergo experience, isn't it? This is a very relevant question that Rahu Gana poses to Bharata. While this is a fact, what Rahu Gana misses out that the experiences that the Atman goes through while in contact with the physical body and the senses, no doubt are true, but these experiences are not natural to the Atman. These experiences that the Atman undergoes are unnatural. They do not belong to its natural state. Only when it is attached to the body, it is because of that sense of attachment of the Atman with its own body that it begins to undergo experiences which are alternating all the time. Rahu Gana misses out on this fundamental fact that because of this strong association, it is only because of this association that the Atman is undergoing these experiences. These experiences do not belong as, they are not natural to the Atman. Just like, again, going back to our popular car analogy, when I am in a car and when the car is damaged, if the car does not belong to me, I am almost not disturbed. If I am the owner of the car and if I have an attachment to the car, even when there is a small scratch on it, I automatically get disturbed. The same thing happens to some other car, most likely does not impact us whatsoever, in whatever manner. So the fact that a car getting damaged need not necessarily disturb us. The disturbance is caused only because of the association. The moment the car gets a relationship through in term an attachment, the car becomes my car. When that my comes in, automatically the disturbance also comes in. When the my goes, there is no disturbance. So therefore, yes, the Atman undergoes these experiences, but the experience is only because of that identification, that attachment with the body, with the sense organs. Now Rahugana continues asking the clarifications. He says, Shasta vigopta nripatihi prajanam yah kinkaro vaina pinashti pishtam. Now earlier, Jadabharata made 2 points. He said, Rahugana, if you think you are the master, I'm sorry, you're mistaken. Neither you are the master, nor I am the master. Both of us are only servants. Nobody can be a master. There's only one master. And also he made a statement. He said, if you endeavor to punish me, it is like grounded grains. Pinashti pishta. This is what Jadabharata commented. Now, Rahugana is seeking clarification. Shasta vigopta nripatihi prajanam yah kinkaro vaina pinashti pishta. Swadharmam aradhanam achyutasya yat ihamano vijahati aghogam. He said, Jadabharata, how can you say this? Granted, there is no eternal master and servant relationship between you and me. Granted, between two jivas, there cannot be a permanent master-servant relationship. I agree. Nevertheless, I am a king. I am a king. Therefore, a king is a master as long as he is a king, and all the citizens are his servants. I am a king, you are my subject, and therefore I am the master, you are a servant. How can you deny this? The king is ordained by Achyuta, Swadharmam Aradhanam Achyutasya, to perform the duty. I am ordained to perform the duty of a king. So when I perform the duty of a king, am I not the master? And also, when I perform the duty of a king, I can punish a subject. And how can you say that punishment is wasteful, like grinding grounded grains? How can you say that? So a king carrying out his duty ordained by Bhagavan Achyuta has to be the master, and he can go about punishing anyone who commits mistakes. Now Rahugana is only missing here 2 very important points. While as a king, he is doing the duty ordained by Achyuta, he is missing the point that playing the role of a king, being a master, is only a role. He, the role player, is distinct and different from the role. Jadabharata was talking about bringing that gap between the role and the role player. The role player, the Atman, embodied Atman, plays several kinds of role. You are not only the king, Rahugana, you are also a father, you are also a son, you are also a friend. And therefore, you are not the king alone. Therefore, you being a master is only temporary. This is what Jadabharata said. So therefore, if one does not realize that the role and the role player are different, that is where the confusion begins. Jadabharata's statement that you are not the master is essentially saying, even though you are playing the role of a master, you, the role player, can never be the master. To know the difference, that the role and the role player are distinct. And also, when Rahugana says, as a king, it is my duty to punish, while it is a duty to punish, one should realize that the Atman is not the doer, is not the punisher. This is exactly what Jadabharata earlier said, that you cannot punishing when you go about trying to punish. It is a futile exercise. Jadabharata meant that one should not ascribe doership to oneself. Rahugana missed out on these two fundamental truths, and therefore he seeks clarification with Jadabharata. He wants to know more about how can one not ascribe doership to oneself. How can one understand the difference between the role player and the role? And then he goes on, Tanme bhavan naradevabhimana madela tucci krita saptamasya krishkishta maitridrisham artabandho yatataresa avadhyanam amhaha. So now, seeking these clarifications, Rahugana submits to Jadabharata. He says, hey Jadabharata, hey Sattama, you are the foremost of all human beings. You are an exalted soul. Krishishta Maitri Drisha. Please, I need your mercy. I need you to be merciful towards me. Hey Artavando, the friend of all those who are distressed. I am also distressed and I need your friendship here. I need you to show mercy. Tanme bhavan naradeva abhimana. Because of my abhimana, the ego in me, thinking that I am the king, therefore I can get away by commanding, get away by trying to be a master. I have committed a sin. Yatatare sat avadhyanam amhaha. I ended up committing a sin of disrespecting you. I used insulting words. Tucci krita. I insulted you unknowingly, without knowing who you are. And therefore, I seek your mercy, your compassion. With your compassion, I'm sure my sins can be washed away. Navikriya vishwasmritsakasya samyena etabhimate mahat vimanat swakritadhimadrin nankshiyati aduradapi shulapanihi. Aduradi shulapanihi. Even if I become as powerful as Shulapani, Paramashiva, by committing the sin of insulting somebody as exalted as you, there is no recourse for me unless and until you forgive me. Therefore, you have to pardon me and you have to show mercy. You are the Vishwasuhrit, the friend of the whole world. You are Vishwasuhrit Sahasya. For you, the welfare of the world is your object of this life. And therefore, I know you will impart Brahmajnana to me. You are the one who have come as a representative of Kapila. And therefore, I seek, I surrender to you, I submit myself to you. Please enlighten me with jnana. Answer all my questions. Give me clarity, so that the disturbed mental state, my mind calms down, so that I can endeavor for liberation. Thus, Rahugana submits himself to Jadabharata. Now, Jadabharata starts his instructions to Rahugana. Jadabharata, after listening to Rahugana, begins to address all his concerns. He goes to the very core of the root cause of all the disturbance and the agitations in Rahugana's mind. Jadabharata Vacha. Natasya tattva grahanaya saksha. Variyasin api vajas samasan. Swapne nurutya grihamedi saukhyam. Nayasya eyanumitam swayam syah. natasya tattva grahanaya sakshat pariyashil api vajas samasan. Jadabharata very interestingly says, natasya tattva grahanaya sakshat pariyashil api vajas samasan. All the glorious utterances in the Upanishads, the Vedanta, the crown of all the Vedas, all those profound utterances, all the lofty messages of the Upanishads will not adequately reveal the truth to those who are grihamedis, he says. Natasya tattva grahanaya sakshat variyashet api vachas samasa. In the karma kanda of the Vedas, all kinds of karmas are prescribed. All kinds of karmas. Therefore, the one who performs all karmas driven by desires, who constantly performs karmas driven by desires, kamya karma, performs all kinds of yajnas for all kinds of rewards, for such a person who is fully engaged, constantly doing activity prescribed by the Shastras, no doubt, but seeking rewards, to such a person, it is almost impossible to discover the truth hidden in the Vedas. Then the Vedas just become a manual for chasing material rewards and nothing more. The Brahmakanda, the concluding portion of the Vedas, which reveal the ultimate truth, will not be easily understood, will be completely missed out. One cannot find, one cannot discover the lofty messages hidden within the Vedas. Here, one needs to understand that the object of a grihastha is so very different from the object of a grihamedi. We also saw earlier in Kapilopadesha a detailed account on a grihamedi. A grihastha and a grihamedi both live together with their families. They are engaged in this world, no doubt. But there is a big difference when it comes to their objective and also their mode of operation. The objective of a grihamedi is sense gratification. The objective of a grihastha is self-realization. The mode of operation of a grihamedi is to consume all the time. The mode of operation of a grihastha is to contribute all the time. That is why grihastha-ashrama dharma is so very critical in one's spiritual evolution. Here, performance of the yajnas and all the karmas prescribed in the karma kanda is for only one purpose. In the process of performing all the prescribed karma, ultimately one needs to realize the temporary nature of all the material rewards. Here, Jadabharata is saying, Swapne nirutya grihamedi saukhyam. The experiences that one undergoes in Swapna, all the experiences are alpa and asthira. Every experience in a dream is alpa and asthira. They are real, but they are alpa and asthira. Alpa, worthless. They are asthira. They are temporary, not permanent. Similarly, the ihalauka sukha and paralauka sukha also need to be recognized as alpa and asthira, worthless and temporary. The whole purpose of all the karmas prescribed in the karma kanda of the Vedas is for one to ultimately recognize the futility of performing kamya karma, futility of all the material rewards, and therefore engage in the pursuit of the ultimate truth, the pursuit of ultimate reality, which is what is revealed by the Brahmakandas, the Upanishads. Now, if one does not cross over that chasm, then one is lost forever in the cycle of samsara, constantly performing only kamya karma all the time. So therefore, Jadabharata says, one needs to realize that one needs to graduate from the objective of sense gratification to self-realization. Graduate from operating in the mode of consuming all the time to a mode of contributing all the time. Only then all the utterances of the Upanishads, the glorious declarations, what the Upanishads teach, one begins to understand the purpose. The revelation happens on the nature of reality. And then the Upanishads become adequate in terms of understanding truth. Until then, it is not adequate at all. So Jadabharata says, therefore, hey Rahugana, yavan mano rajasa purushasya satvenava tamasa vanuruddham chetubit akutibir atanoti nirankusam kaushalam chetaram va. Yavan manaha rajasa purushasya satvenava tamasa. As long as one's mind is dominated by the three gunas of sattva, rajas, and tamas, or anuruddham, dominated. As long as the mind is dominated by the three forces of sattva, rajas, and tamas, tamo gunas, chetovir akutibhir atanoti, the mind constantly will work with the jnanendriyas and the karmendriyas, the organs of perception and the organs of action, all the sense organs, and will continue to perform actions, and the body will continue to perform actions which result in both punya karma and papa karma. Nirankusham kushalam chetaramba. The mind is like an uncontrolled, untrammeled elephant. It will constantly create chaos all the time, which is what happens when one continues to perform actions which will yield both punya and papa, and one will be stuck in the cycle of samsara all the time. Savasanatma vishayoparaktaha gunapravaha vikrita shodashatma vibhritapritan nabhamapi rupavedam antarbahishvam cha puraistanoti. Antarbahishvam cha puraistanoti. The mind always vibratan nabhibi rupa bheda avantar pravishtacha puraistanoti. It is the cause for taking several names, several forms, several bodies. It is the mind which is the cause for continuation of the Atman in the cycle of samsara, assuming different kinds of bodies one after a time, all the time. This mind, which is the storehouse of vasanas, is attached to the objects of pleasure and tossed by the forces of the three gunas. It is subject to agitations in the form of kama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, matsaryas all the time. Shodashatma, the mind, even though it is the foremost of all the 16 constituents of the subtle body, the Atman is embodied, and there is a physical body and there is a subtle body. The subtle body has 16 constituents: the physical elements, the panchabhutas, and the jnanendriyas, the panchajnanendriyas, and the panchakarmendriyas, all put together are 15, and the manas, which is the 16. Of these 16 constituents of the subtle body, the mind is the foremost. But even though it is the foremost, when with the force of the gunas, the hierarchy gets completely reversed. And the mind becomes the subservient, the mind which is supposed to be the supervisor in the factory of life, and the senses to be the workers. The hierarchy gets reversed, and the mind submits to all the senses and gets dragged along. The vasanas in the mind completely take over. And when that happens, the mind is always attached to various objects of pleasures. And That is the cause for continued tendency of the Atman in the cycle of samsara, repeatedly taking births and acquiring different kinds of physical bodies all the time. Jadabharata says it is important to recognize that the mind can push up or pull down. Push up or pull down. Now it is like when we are holding on to a heavy object. Now when we let go of the object, the heavy object naturally gravitates towards the floor. The law of gravity ensures that the object falls down naturally towards the floor. Similarly, the mind, when it is ruled by the forces of three gunas, naturally gravitates towards the sense objects. Naturally gravitates, follows the senses towards the sense objects. Just like how one needs to endeavor with special effort to hold on to this heavy object from not falling down, not the heavy object not getting pulled down. In order to push up, one needs an effort. Similarly, in order to ensure that the mind does not gravitate towards the world of sense objects, one needs to necessarily exert additional effort in order to ensure that the mind can be pushed up. The mind operates like a channel for the consciousness. The mind is a channel to the external world. The mind is like a window to the world. The mind is like a window to the world. The mind operates like a window to the world, and all the sense organs, by design, they bring in external stimuli of all the objects presented to it are brought in by the sense organs to the mind, or routed to the mind, and the mind then as a window presents them to the Atman. Now, this window called mind also plays another role. It is not just a natural window. All of a sudden, this window also becomes like a TV, like a screen that starts to play different kinds of movies. And it chooses what movie to play at various times, whether we like it or not. So therefore, the mind chooses to repeatedly play different kinds of movies which is shown, and then the Atman is spellbound, captivated by what the mind shows to it all the time. While the mind has a role to perform as a window to the world, the mind also has another important role. It has to perform, operate as a mirror to the Atman as well. If the mind does not operate as a mirror to the Atman, then there cannot be self-realization. The mind has to perform as a mirror and reflect the nature of the Atman. Mind has two important roles to play. The role of a mirror is a lot more important than the role of a window to the world. The role of a window to the world is important, no doubt, but it also has to play the role of, it has to operate as a mirror. But unfortunately, the mind, while operating as a mirror, also operates as a distorted mirror because of the karma that covers the mind, covers the mirror. When there is dust on the mirror, there is distortion. Therefore, the mind presents a distorted view of our own nature. It shows us not as actually as who we are, but it shows us as to what the world wants us to see. And therefore, the mind also presents a distorted view of our own nature. And in that process, we are completely spellbound by that mind. And this is the reason why here Jadabharata says, such a mind ensures that the Atman is completely ignorant of its own nature. It is only seeing what the mind wants it to see, and the mind is playing, the vasanas are completely dominating, and the Atman is spellbound, completely identifying with the images shown by the mind. This is what Krishna also in the Gita says, Sattvam Rajas Tamayiti Gunaha Prakriti Sambhavaha Nibadnanti Mahabaho Dehe Dehinam Apyayam. Nibadnanti Mahabaho Nibadnanti Dehe Dehinam Avyayam. The Dehi, the Atman, the changeless Atman, the moment the Atman is completely associated with the mind, which is the product of the three gunas of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, is completely spellbound. And this is the cause for continuation of bondage, he says. We can take a simple analogy of a smartphone. We are all, who doesn't know a smartphone? Somebody said a smartphone can be described as a phone. A smartphone is a phone which smartly makes us unsmart. And that is a smartphone. Unfortunately, it has taken over all our lives. So when we all know that a smartphone comes up with default settings. Every smartphone comes up with a default settings. It has a certain way how the screen is set, the certain way how the applications behave, a certain, the browser comes with its own default home page. So therefore, the software loaded in the device comes with certain default settings. Now, similar to this, every body, when the Atman inherits, associates itself with the body also comes with certain default settings. The Atman, the default settings, so the default settings determine, just like how the default settings determine how the applications behave, how the screen behaves, how the browser behaves. The home, naturally, when you click on the browser, it goes to the default home page. Similarly, our mind has a default home page. For some, the default home page can be a home page on food. For some, the default home page can be a home page on money. Depending on the mental makeup, the default home page can be sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic. Depending on the default settings of the software, the device behaves. Similarly, the default settings in our mind, the body, we behave based on those default settings. And we know from the smartphone that these default settings are changeable. If we need for the phone to behave differently, we can change the settings. Similarly, the mental makeup can also be changed. The default settings can be changed, but we need to recognize these default settings. We need to recognize, and only then we can change the default settings, and only by changing the default settings, we can change our mental makeup. Until then, the default setting, the settings will determine how the mind behaves, and depending on how the mind operates, the course of our actions are determined. And therefore, Jadabharata here very clearly says, hey, Rajan, you need to understand that this mind of yours, as the Shastras declare, Manayeva Manushyanam Karanam Mandahetuho Dukkham Sukham Yatiriktam Cha Tibram Kalopapannam Phalam Avyanakti Alingyamaya Rachitantaratma Swadehinam Samsrishti Chakrakutaha. He says, Dukkham Sukham Yatiriktam Cha Tibram Kalopapannam Phalam Avyanakti. He says, once embodied, the Atman is experiencing continuously Sukha and Dukkha, and the mind is constantly undergoing agitations, fluctuations going on all the time. It cannot be avoided. Purushaha prakatistohi bhunte prakatijan gunam karanam gunasantosya sadasad yoni janmasu. Purushaha prakritistohi bhunte prakatijan gunam. As long as The Purusha, the Atman, is situated in Prakriti, is associated with Prakriti. As long as the Atma is indwelling in the body, it has to experience the pains and pleasures through the body. It has to experience the pains and pleasures, but it cannot identify with those experiences. But as long as it continues to be identifying with those experiences, it will continue to do so. The body will keep changing, but the continuation of experiences will go on. The experience of pains and pleasures will go on and on and on. Kalopapannam phalam abhyanakti. Here Jadabharata makes a very profound statement. He says, Alingyamaya rachitantaratma swadehinam samsrishti chakrakutaha. Swadehinam samsrishti chakrakutaha. The Dehi, the Atman, caught in this cycle, Chakrakutaha, Samsrishti, Samsara, cycle of Samsara, this embodied Atman, Alingyamaya Rachitantaratma. He beautifully says, he does not just say the Atman is situated together with the Paramatman in the body. He says, Alingyamaya Rachitantaratma. This Atma is in embrace with the Paramatma. It is in tight embrace with the Paramatma, the embodied Atman, but unfortunately, it does not recognize the Paramatma, who is the Antaryami, and because of its being covered by this ignorance within of this karma, because of that, because of its association, with a strong association with the mind, even though it is in tight embrace with the Paramatma, it does not recognize, it is not aware of the presence of this Antaryami within. And therefore, it continues to experience Sukha and Dukkha, alternating all the time, and continues its tendency in samsara. That recognition of realization of its own essence and the presence of the source of shelter of all shelters. Both are not there. And when both are not there, the Atman is in a state of ignorance, completely identified with the mind. And the mind is completely ruled by the senses and the forces of three gunas. And therefore, there is no way out for this Atman. There is no way out from this cycle of samsara. Swadehinam samsrishti chakrakutaha. Therefore, it goes on continuing in the cycle, taking repeated births after births, and getting associated with different kinds of physical bodies without knowing what is the true shelter, that unchangeable foundation that can actually give it a sense of everlasting security. The unchangeable, everlasting security can never be found as long as this Atman is continuing in this cycle, in this Chakrakota. Jadabharata will continue to impart a lot more on the nature of this Atman and how this Atman can bring about, how there can be awareness of this realization and the recognition of the nature of his essence and the presence of the Paramatma within. We will continue with this fascinating conversation between Rahu Gana and Jadabharata next week. Sarvam Sri Krishna Arpanamstu.